Coffee for two at midnight. Chapter 1. Midnight Cafe. The clock above the counter struck 12 when Robert pushed the door open. The old brass bell above it gave a soft, familiar chime, the same sound it had made 30 years ago. Time had changed almost everything in the town, but somehow this little cafe at the corner of Maple and Third refused to surrender. The scent of coffee still lingered in the air, mixed with a faint trace of cinnamon and old wood. The walls were lined with photographs that had faded under the dim, yellow light, snapshots of faces, long forgotten. There were no crowds tonight, just the quiet hum of a refrigerator and the soft hiss of rain brushing against the window. Robert paused by the doorway, umbrella dripping onto the floor. He removed his hat, shook off the rain, and looked around. It felt smaller now, or maybe he had grown larger, older, heavier, quieter. The same booths were there, the same red vinyl cracked from time and heat, and there, by the far window, was the table, their table. He walked slowly toward it, his cane tapping softly against the tiled floor. It felt almost like a pilgrimage. The waitress, a young girl, maybe 22, smiled as she passed by with a pot of coffee. "Sit anywhere you like, sir," she said. He smiled back faintly. "Thank you, darling. I'll just take the window seat." The seat creaked under his weight. He looked out through the rain-slicked glass. The street outside was empty, except for a single lamppost casting light on the wet pavement. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you listen to your own heart. When the waitress returned, she poured him a cup without asking what he wanted. Maybe it was obvious. At this hour, in a place like this, everyone drank coffee. Strong, black, and a little bitter. "Will you be expecting anyone?" she asked kindly. Robert looked up at her for a long moment before answering. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe not." She nodded, smiled politely, and walked away. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. The steam rose in delicate spirals, and for a moment he closed his eyes. The smell alone was enough to take him back to another night, another rain, another version of this very moment. It was 1989. The jukebox in the corner still worked then. It played old jazz records, and Margaret used to hum along, softly, like she was afraid to disturb the air. She always sat by the window, same as now, her hair catching the light from the street. He could still see her, as if the glass itself remembered. She'd rest her chin on her hand and look at him, with that half-smile, the kind that said she already knew what he was thinking. Robert took a sip of coffee. It was too hot, too bitter, but he didn't mind. Back then, he used to tease her about that. "You always drink it black," he'd said once. "Sweet things make me forget I'm awake," she had replied, laughing. He smiled faintly at the memory. That laugh, he hadn't heard it in decades. Yet it still lingered somewhere between the walls and the ticking of the clock. He had met Margaret here, by accident. She was sitting alone, reading a book of poems. He was traveling for work, a salesman of something. He couldn't even remember anymore. She had dropped her spoon. He had picked it up. And somehow that simple act turned into an hour-long conversation about nothing and everything. Rain had fallen that night too. The memory played like an old film reel in his head. The soft murmur of the cafe, the sound of raindrops, the warmth of her eyes. He remembered thinking, this is what peace feels like. Now, peace felt different. It felt like silence that had gone on too long. He took another sip, placed the cup back on its saucer, and looked at the empty seat across from him. "Still late, huh?" he whispered, almost smiling. He imagined her answer. That gentle sigh, the teasing tone. "You were early again, Robert." You always were. He chuckled softly, the sound swallowed by the hum of the lights. The young waitress returned. Would you like a refill? She asked. He nodded. Please. As she poured, she noticed the untouched cup across the table. Should I bring another? She asked kindly. Robert hesitated, eyes on the window. Outside, the rain was slowing. He thought for a moment, then said, Yes, yes, she have one too. The waitress smiled, said nothing, and returned with a second cup. She placed it gently on the other side, steam rising into the dim cafe air. Robert looked at the two cups, one for him, one for her. Coffee for two, just like always. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against the empty air. It's been a while, he whispered. I wasn't sure you'd still come. The rain stopped completely. The clock ticked louder. Somewhere outside, a distant train passed through the valley, the same sound that had once marked their goodbyes. He closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he could almost feel her there again. The warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she stared at the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. When he opened his eyes again, only the coffee remained, two cups, side by side, one half empty, one untouched. He left a few dollars on the table and stood up slowly. His knees ached, but he didn't mind. Before leaving, he looked back once more at the table, at the window, at the ghost of a memory that refused to fade. He whispered softly, Same time next week, Margaret. Then he placed his hat back on, stepped out into the cool night, and disappeared down the quiet street, his reflection following him in the puddles. The bell above the door chimed once more, then fell silent. Inside, the two cups of coffee sat there beneath the dim light, one steaming gently, the other waiting, as if time itself were holding its breath. Chapter 2. The woman by the window. He remembered her most clearly through glass, always by the window, always with the same faraway look in her eyes, as if she were watching the world pass by but never truly belonging to it. Margaret had that kind of stillness that could quiet a room. She didn't need to speak to be noticed. She carried silence like a melody, and the world listened. Robert often wondered, even now, what she had been thinking during those long pauses. Maybe she was remembering something too. Maybe she was somewhere else entirely, a place where time didn't bruise, and people didn't leave. He leaned back in the booth and watched the rain slide down the cafe window, tracing thin silver lines that caught the streetlight. The sound of it reminded him of the night they first met, the night everything ordinary became something worth remembering. It had been one of those quiet Fridays in autumn. The town had already gone to sleep, except for a few restless souls who found comfort in the hum of the coffee machine and the distant jazz whispering from the jukebox. He had been younger then, though even then, his heart felt older than his years. She was sitting by the window, a book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She was simply turning the pages, as though trying to keep herself company with the sound of paper moving. A half-empty cup sat by her hand, and her scarf, pale blue, frayed at the ends, fell loosely around her shoulders. When she looked up for the first time, he almost forgot to breathe, not because she was beautiful in a way that startled the world, but because she looked real, so heartbreakingly human. There was something fragile and unfinished in her gaze, like a painting left half done. He had dropped his change while paying at the counter. The coins scattered across the floor, rolling toward her table. She bent down to help him, their hands brushing for a brief, electric second. He'd felt the warmth of her fingers, cool, soft, and trembling slightly, and it was enough to make his heart stutter. "You should be more careful," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He'd laughed nervously. "Maybe I wanted an excuse to say hello. Then I suppose you've succeeded." That was the first time he heard her voice. Quiet, low, and steady, like the last note of a song. He used to think love began with fireworks or sudden certainty, but with Margaret, it began with quiet, a slow unfolding, a comfort that felt like home. They began meeting by accident, or so they both pretended. He'd arrive a few minutes earlier, always pretending to read the paper. She'd walk in a little after, always pretending not to look for him. And then, when their eyes finally met across the cafe, both would smile, that small, private kind of smile that only exists between two people who understand the same silence. She told him once, "I like this place because no one rushes here." He had nodded. "Then I suppose it's the right place for us." Now, sitting alone after all those years, Robert traced the edge of his coffee cup with his finger. The porcelain was smooth, cold now. He could almost see her reflection in the window. That same blue scarf, the same soft hair falling over her cheek. He wondered if she ever came back here after she left. Did she sit by the window again, order her coffee black, and listen to the rain? Did she remember him, even for a moment? Some memories fade softly, like colors in old photographs. Others stay sharp, cutting through time with impossible clarity. Margaret was one of those. The years hadn't dulled her. If anything, the distance had made her more vivid, as though absence had painted her in deeper hues. He could still recall the way she used to tap her finger against the table when thinking, a tiny rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Sometimes, when the night was long and sleep refused to come, he would hear that sound in his mind, tap, 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 and it was almost enough to make him believe she was still near. Margaret had once said she loved the rain because it made everything honest. People hide behind sunshine, she told him, but in the rain you can't pretend. Everyone looks a little sad, and that's the truth of it. At the time, he hadn't understood. He'd laughed, told her she was being poetic. Now, after all the years, after all the empty cups and lonely nights, he finally knew what she meant. Sadness, he thought, was the only thing that stayed faithful. He took another sip of coffee, though it had gone cold. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The streetlight flickered, and for an instant, he saw a shadow move by the window, just the shape of a woman, passing. He froze, his heart tightening like a fist. The shadow paused, as if hesitating, and for that one breath of a moment, he felt it, the unmistakable, familiar weight of her presence. But when he looked again, the sidewalk was empty. Only the rain remained. He smiled faintly to himself. "You still like teasing me, don't you?" he murmured. The bell above the door rang softly as another customer entered, a young couple, laughing quietly, their hands brushing. Robert watched them for a while. The way they looked at each other, shy, unsure, hopeful, reminded him of two people who once sat in the same booth, a lifetime ago. He looked down at his coffee. There it was again. That ache that wasn't pain, but something gentler. The ache of remembering something beautiful that you can never touch again. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It was worn at the edges, the color fading to sepia. Margaret was sitting by the window, sunlight spilling across her face. She wasn't smiling at the camera. She was smiling at him, whoever he used to be back then. He traced her outline with his thumb. "You always hated pictures," he whispered, "but I'm glad I took this one." He placed the photo back into his pocket carefully, as though afraid it might crumble. Then he looked out the window again, watching the reflection of the 2 cups on the table. One full, one empty. It's strange, he thought, how some absences feel like company. The clock struck 1. The rain stopped completely. He sat there a while longer, listening to the silence settle around him at dusk. When he finally rose to leave, he left both cups on the table, just as before. As he reached the door, he turned back once more toward the window, and for a brief second, he could have sworn he saw her, sitting there, exactly as she had been, eyes half lost in thought, waiting for him to arrive. Then the bell chimed, and the vision dissolved into the quiet air of the midnight cafe. Chapter 3. Seasons of Silence *. The years did not leave all at once. They slipped away quietly, like dust on a forgotten shelf, unnoticed until the light hit it just right. At first, there was no change. The cafe was still there, the same chairs, the same rain. Robert would arrive at the usual time, and Margaret would already be waiting, her hands wrapped around her cup as though trying to hold on to the warmth before it vanished. Their conversations were still easy then, drifting from books to music to small absurdities that only made sense between 2 people who'd spent too much time together. But sometimes, in the pauses, a faint unease began to settle. The world was changing, faster than either of them could follow. Robert felt it first. It was in the way she looked out the window longer than before, the way she smiled, but her eyes stayed elsewhere. She still listened, but sometimes he could tell she wasn't really hearing him, and he didn't blame her. Life had started to ask more of them. Bills, work, family, distance. All the quiet things that build a wall without meaning to. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking. He wanted to say, "Stay here. Stay with me, even if we don't have the words." But he didn't. He had never been good at interrupting silence. Margaret noticed it too. Robert had grown quieter, not in a cruel way, but in the way people do when they begin to carry too many unspoken thoughts. He would stare into his coffee longer, nodding at things she said, but not really replying. Sometimes she caught him watching her like he was memorizing her face, as if he expected her to disappear any moment. That frightened her, though she didn't know why. Maybe because a part of her already knew he was right. One evening, she told him she'd been offered a position in another town, a teaching job by the coast. She said it casually, as if it were a small detail. But when she saw the way his hand froze halfway to his cup, she knew it wasn't. "It's only a year," she said softly. "A year is a long time," he answered. She smiled faintly, reaching across the table. "It's just time, Robert. We've beaten time before." But time, she knew, was patient. It always wins by waiting. The cafe became their clock. Each week they met. Each week something small faded, a laugh, a glance, the way their hands found each other across the table without needing to ask. Letters replaced conversations, then fewer letters, then silence. Margaret wrote of the sea, of her students, of the way the wind smelled different by the shore. Robert replied with stories of the town, the repairs to his house, the coffee shop still standing. But between the lines, both felt it, the soft collapse of something they hadn't known how to name. Sometimes her letters would arrive with the faint scent of salt and lavender. He would read them slowly, every word a heartbeat. But then one winter, no letter came. Then another. Margaret's voice. There were things she wanted to say, but not on paper. How the nights by the coast felt colder without his voice. How she'd begun to speak to him in her mind, answering questions he hadn't asked. But she didn't write any of it, because she knew he would read those words with hope. And hope was a fragile thing, too fragile for the truth. The truth was that she didn't know how to come back anymore, not because she didn't want to, but because the person she had been with him felt far away, blurred by the tide of days. She loved him still, but differently, not as a present flame, but as an ember she kept warm in her hands when the world went dark. Robert's voice. He tried not to resent the silence. He told himself she was busy, that she would write, that maybe her letters had simply been lost in the post, that deep down he knew that silence is a language too. Still, he kept going to the cafe. Every Sunday, same booth, same seat. He would order 2 coffees, because it hurt less than ordering one. Sometimes the waitress would glance at him with quiet pity. "Will she be joining you tonight?" she'd ask, and he'd nod. "She's on her way." He'd say it every time, as if saying it might make it true. Seasons turned like pages in a forgotten book. Spring came, then autumn again. The trees outside the cafe shed their leaves, and Robert watched them gather by the curb, the same way he watched the years gather around him, softly, inevitably. He still kept one of Margaret's old letters folded inside his wallet. The ink had faded, the edges torn. He never reread it anymore, but he couldn't throw it away. It wasn't just a letter, it was proof that once someone had thought of him at midnight. Margaret sometimes thought of calling. Sometimes she even dialed the number halfway, her finger trembling over the last digit. But what would she say? "I miss you" felt too small. "I'm sorry" felt too late. So she hung up before the line connected. Then she would pour herself a cup of coffee, black, and sit by her window, not the same one, but close enough, and whisper his name into the dark. Sometimes she thought she could almost hear an echo. The years stretched thinner, like the last notes of a song fading into air. Robert stopped bringing 2 cups eventually, not out of anger, but out of surrender. He began to bring only 1, but always left the opposite chair empty. A quiet tribute, or maybe a superstition. He'd sit there, watching the rain, listening for the sound of the doorbell that never rang. One night, long after closing, the waitress found him still sitting there, half asleep, his hand resting on the table, the empty cup before him. She asked if he was waiting for someone. He smiled faintly. "Not waiting," he said, "just remembering." And she nodded, because she understood. The whole cafe, by then, seemed built from the same kind of remembering. Margaret, miles away, stood by the sea one winter evening. The wind was sharp, the horizon grey. She watched the waves fold and vanish. Again and again, the same motion, endlessly repeated. She thought of him. She thought of the little cafe and the man who always came early, just to make sure the coffee was warm when she arrived. Then she whispered into the wind, "You were right, Robert. A year is a long time." The sea swallowed her words, carrying them somewhere he would never hear. Back in the small town, snow began to fall. Through the cafe window, Robert watched it cover the empty street. He thought of her, not as she had been, but as she was in memory, forever by the window, forever turning her cup, forever about to speak. And in that quiet moment, he realized that some silences aren't empty at all. Some are simply full of everything that was never said. Chapter 4. The letter found too late. The winter rain had come early that year. It fell softly over Maple Street, coating the cobblestones in a silver glaze. The cafe's windows glowed faintly against the fog, but Robert didn't go inside tonight. He stood under the awning for a while, the sound of rain drumming above him, and then kept walking down the quiet street, the same route, He had walked for decades. His steps were slower now, heavy with the weight of memory. He carried a small box under his arm, one he had found that morning in the attic, while looking for an old photograph. The box had been sealed with brittle tape and covered in dust. On its lid, faint handwriting read, "For Robert, in case I never get the chance." He had stopped breathing for a moment when he saw her name below it, Margaret. Inside, the box smelled faintly of old paper and lavender, the scent she used to wear. There were photographs, folded napkins from the cafe, and at the bottom, a single envelope. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and the ink had bled slightly, but the handwriting was unmistakable. To Robert, from Margaret, dated March 17, 1991. He sat at his kitchen table for a long while before opening it. The rain against the windows sounded almost like her voice. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal, careful not to tear the paper more than time already had. The first words made his chest tighten. The letter, "My dearest Robert, if you are reading this, then I never found the courage to send it. I hope the years have been kind to you. I hope the cafe still stands, that the clock still ticks above the counter, and that somewhere in the corner, 2 cups of coffee still wait for no one. I have tried to write to you many times. Each attempt began with your name, and each time I stopped there. There was so much I wanted to say, too much, perhaps, and yet silence has its own way of becoming unbearable. Do you remember the last night we spent together at the cafe? It was raining, of course. I sometimes think the rain was our witness. I wanted to tell you then that I was leaving, not just for the job, but because I was afraid of loving you more than the life I had built, afraid of what would happen if I stayed. You once told me that love was a quiet thing. You were right, but you never said how loud its absence could be." Robert stopped reading for a moment. His eyes blurred. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady and indifferent. He rested the letter on the table and rubbed his forehead, trying to slow the ache behind his eyes. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly. He imagined her sitting somewhere by the sea, pen in hand, her hair moving with the wind as she wrote these words. He could almost see her pausing, biting her lip the way she always did when searching for the right sentence. He turned the page and continued. "I thought leaving would make it easier, that distance might soften what we were into something manageable, something safe. But I was wrong. Every night I sat by my window, and I saw you in every empty chair, in every shadow that passed. I spoke to you out loud once. I said, 'You were right, Robert. Silence is the hardest sound.' There were moments I almost came back. Once, I even packed a bag, but I would look at the train schedule, see the miles between us, and feel the years waiting on the other side. I was afraid that by the time I arrived, you wouldn't be there, or worse, that you would be, and you wouldn't recognize the woman I'd become. If I could give you anything, it would be this, the certainty that you were loved, not briefly, not conditionally, but deeply. You taught me how to sit still in the world. You gave me quiet when all I'd known was noise. For that, I am endlessly grateful. I hope, someday, when the coffee is warm and the rain gentle, you'll think of me, not with sadness, but with peace. Yours always, even in silence, Margaret." He set the letter down and just sat there, breathing. The house felt smaller, heavier with ghosts that suddenly had names again. He read the letter twice more, tracing her handwriting with his fingers, the small loops, the careful slant of her Emmett felt as if she was speaking directly to him, as if the decades between them had folded into this single fragile moment. For a long while, He didn't move. The rain eased outside, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Then he folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. He turned off the kitchen light, took his coat, and left the house. The walk to the cafe felt different that night. The street shimmered under streetlights, the puddles glowing like little mirrors. Inside, the cafe was quiet. Only one other person sat at the counter. The waitress looked up as he entered, recognized him, and smiled softly. "Cold night," she said. Robert nodded. "I've known colder." He sat at their table, the same one by the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. An old man with tired eyes, holding a folded letter. He ordered 2 coffees. When they arrived, he placed 1 cup across from him, just like always. Then, slowly, he unfolded the letter and placed it beside the cup. "This came a bit late," he whispered, smiling faintly. The smell of coffee rose between them, warm and familiar. He imagined her there, maybe not young, maybe not quite as he remembered, but present all the same. Outside, the town was silent. Inside, time stood still. Robert reached for his cup, took a sip, and let the warmth spread through him. Then he leaned back and began to read the letter aloud, softly, to the empty chair. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. Each word filled the space like a benediction. "If you are reading this, then I never found the courage to send it." He paused after each paragraph, as if waiting for her to answer. When he finished, he folded the letter again and held it to his chest. A single tear slipped down his cheek, but his smile didn't fade. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The waitress came by to refill his cup, but stopped when she saw him, sitting so quietly. "You okay, Mr. Hale?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I'm better than I've been in a long time." She smiled and moved away, leaving him to his peace. Robert stayed until closing time. When he finally rose, he left 1 cup untouched, and beside it, the envelope with Margaret's name, facing upward. "Someone will find it," he murmured, "and maybe they'll understand." As he stepped outside, the rain began again, soft, forgiving. He lifted his face to it, eyes closed. That night, back home, he placed the letter on his knitstand and turned off the lamp. The room smelled faintly of paper and rain. Sleep came slowly, but it came, and in the dream that followed, he was sitting once more in the cafe. Margaret was across from him, her hands folded around her cup, smiling that quiet smile that said everything words could not. There was no distance there, no years, no silence, only 2 cups of coffee, still warm, and the world outside blurred by gentle rain. Chapter 5 Coffee for 2. Again, the spring that followed was slow and soft, the kind of season that seemed unsure of itself. The mornings were still cold enough for a breath to fog the air, but the afternoons carried the faint smell of lilacs drifting in from the edge of town. Robert had stopped counting the years. Time no longer felt like something that moved forward. It simply folded in on itself, a series of echoes that kept returning to the same quiet places. The cafe, the attic, the letter. He read Margaret's letter every Sunday morning, always at the same time, always at the kitchen table, the same light falling across the page. Sometimes he whispered the words aloud. Other times he just held the paper in his hands, feeling the faint texture of her writing. The ink had faded, but the meaning had not. One day, in late April, he decided to return to the cafe again. He hadn't been there since that night, the night of the letter, and though he told himself it was just for the coffee, he knew it wasn't. The cafe had changed, but not much. The wooden booths had been replaced, the walls painted a softer shade of green, but the scent, the blend of coffee, old wood, and rain was still the same. The new waitress was young, probably no older than Margaret had been when they first met. She smiled when he entered. "Good afternoon, sir. Table for one." Robert looked at her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Two, please, by the window." She hesitated, then nodded and led him to the familiar corner. He took off his coat and sat down, his hands resting on the table. Outside, the street shimmered with sunlight after a brief morning rain. The waitress brought her cups, just as he'd asked. "Expecting someone?" she asked lightly. "In a way," he said. "She's late, but she always is." The waitress smiled, unsure whether it was a joke. She set the cups down and left him in peace. Robert sat in silence, the hum of quiet conversations floating around him. He could almost hear Margaret's laughter between the sounds, soft, careful, the way she used to laugh when she tried to hide her shyness. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the letter. The paper was more fragile now, folded many times, the edges nearly translucent. He laid it gently on the table beside the untouched cup. He read a few lines again, quietly to himself. "If I could give you anything, it would be this, the certainty that you were loved." He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. The cafe seemed to fade away for a moment, replaced by memory, the golden light of a summer long gone. Margaret's voice saying his name like a promise. When he opened his eyes, he thought he saw her. Just for a second, the shape of her reflection in the window, the way her hand might reach toward her cup. It wasn't frightening or surreal. It was peaceful. He smiled, and the reflection smiled back. Outside, a group of children ran past the cafe window, laughing, their shoes splashing in puddles. Life unchanged. Robert watched them with quiet affection. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand that love was not about possession or even proximity. It was about presence, the kind that lingers long after the body is gone. He lifted his cup, toasted the empty seat across from him, and whispered, "To us." The coffee was warm, strong, slightly bitter, just the way she liked it. When the afternoon light began to fade, he left a few bills on the table and rose slowly, slipping the letter back into his pocket. Before leaving, he looked once more at the cup across from him. The steam had vanished, but somehow the air around it still felt warm. As he reached the door, the young waitress called after him, "Sir, you forgot something." He turned. She was holding the envelope. Robert smiled gently. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe someone will read it one day." She looked puzzled but nodded. "It's beautiful paper," she said softly. "It's a beautiful story," Robert replied. "It just took too long to finish." Then he stepped outside. The evening light was gold and thin, brushing against the storefronts and street. Signs like an artist's last strokes on a canvas. Robert walked slowly down Maple Street, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. He passed the old bookstore, now closed, and the park where the trees had just begun to bloom. The world smelled alive again. As he neared his home, he stopped under a tall oak tree, the same spot where he and Margaret once sat, watching fireflies on a warm night decades ago. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the wind move through the leaves. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "It's not silence anymore." And he smiled. That night, he placed a second coffee cup on his knit stand beside the letter. The rain began softly outside, a gentle rhythm on the roof. Before turning off the lamp, he whispered, "Good night, Margaret." For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. The quiet wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. And as he drifted towards sleep, he dreamed again of the cafe. 2 cups, 2 chairs, the sound of rain, and in that dream, no one was late.